criminal behaviorology, to assist the criminal and civil justice systems, to improve our society. A podcast like no other. Here is your host, Timothy Joseph.
Hello, and this is Criminal Behaviorology. I'm your host, Timothy Joseph. I hope you missed us. We're back making podcasts. We've had a lot of interest in the field. I'm going to be speaking at the Massachusetts Association for Applied Behavior Analysis on applied behavior analysis in the criminal justice system. May have a few more speaking engagements in the future. Gotten a lot of interest from people in our field that want to pursue careers, supervision, things of that nature. And so it's all very exciting. I have a really good guest today, and it is Tony Biglan, author of The Nurture Effect. Tony has been an advocate, researcher, and behavior analyst for many years. His 2015 book covers many areas, including adolescent behavior problems, cigarette smoking, mental health treatment, corporate influence through precise, behaviorally derived marketing campaigns. In this discussion, Tony gives us an optimistic worldview, but shows the need for how behavioral science is the key to making a better world. So he talks about his own personal journey in seeing how behavior analysis can be used to solve interpersonal and mental health problems. He talks about the good behavior game and the reduction in child misconduct, private prisons and criminal justice, acceptance and commitment therapy, and schizophrenia. A lot of topics here. Corporations marketing to the young. Tony's thoughts on capitalism and modern society, the significance of the Powell memo, and his appearance where I sat right next to him at the 2018 Association for Behavior Analysis International Substance Abuse Conference that was in Washington, D.C. I was sitting next to him in the audience, and he went up and gave a very insightful talk to the audience. So, enjoy the podcast. The views expressed by Tony and all our guests do not necessarily reflect those of criminal behaviorology, nor our sponsors, if we had any. But it's a great talk nonetheless. Go ahead and look up his website, values2action.org, and let's just go ahead and get to the interview with Tony. Okay, we are here with Tony Biglan, author of The Nurture Effect, How the Science of Human Behavior Can Improve Our Lives and Our World. So, thank you, Tony. How are you today?
I'm well. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So, just to start off, what can you tell us about your own personal journey and what led you to the interest in the nurture effect, the concepts of behaviorism? Where did you start out on these ideas, and where are you now?
Well, I'm 77 years old, so it's a long story. You may have to cut me off. I was trained in social psychology and organizational psychology at the University of Illinois. And for my doctoral dissertation, I decided that I wanted to study the relationship between academic areas and the organization of university departments, something I'm a long way from now. Mm-hmm. And so I did an analysis where I got scholars to tell me how they saw the similarities and differences among academic areas. And I had 36 academic areas, and I got data from 36 different, 5 scholars in each of these areas. And we did a multidimensional scaling of the characteristics of academic areas. Mm-hmm. And what we found was that you could dimensionalize academic areas in three dimensions, pure and applied, biological, non-biological, and the one that accounted for the most variance was what I came to call paradigmatic and non-paradigmatic. So the paradigmatic areas were areas that had a clear paradigm, physics, chemistry, also the applied aspects of that, engineering and so on, all had a pretty well worked out paradigm. And at the other end, there were things like philosophy and literature and history and so on that didn't really have a paradigm that everybody agreed on. And in fact, if you looked at that, psychology was over to the non-paradigmatic side. And this is in 1970. And I looked at that and said, that's about right. You know, there's people with this theory of psychology and that theory of psychology and so on. So I published that. And it was actually about 10 years later, our librarian came to me with a paper that was titled The Biglan Model, Case Study of an Eponym. So I ran to the dictionary to find out what an eponym was, and it's something that's named for somebody like Brownian motion. Okay. And it turns out that people had found this analysis very helpful in terms of understanding academic fields. And library science used it, or people working in an organization of universities. And in fact, the Biglan model is still the thing that is, I get the most, but I left the field, it never did me any good, but anyway. So about that time, I was, and this was in 1970. And this was a time when we were against the war in Vietnam, and I was involved in radical politics, and and it was like, what are you into, right? So I started talking to Robert Kohlenberg, who had an office across the hall from mine, and I was teaching something that I described to him, and he said, "Yeah, but they've got it all wrong. It's B.F. Skinner is what you need to read." So I started reading B.F. Skinner. And at first I was reading verbal behavior, and I didn't really understand that. So I started reading the 1953 book.
Science and Human Behavior?
Right.
Yeah.
So as I'm reading that, I'm beginning to realize that he's proposing a paradigm. That he's arguing that every aspect of human behavior can be understood in terms of the selection of behavior by its consequences, and that actually fits into the larger scheme of evolutionary theory. So I started reading that, and I decided that I didn't want to be a social psychologist. I want to be a clinical psychologist, and I applied for an internship at the University of Wisconsin, and I spent a year at the University of Wisconsin. And I had a $500 book allowance, which in 1970 was a hell of a lot of money. And I didn't have that much to do, so I read and read and read. And I had a mentor there who was a psychiatrist who'd read everything in behavioral science and so on. And I became a behaviorist, a behavior therapist, and so on. So that changed my thinking. I told you I had a long answer to your question.
What was it like being a behavior therapist, as you might call it, back in those early days?
Well, I was one of a couple of people, young, new PhDs who were into behavioral stuff in an analytically oriented psychiatry department, and they put up with us.
Okay.
I began to learn to use behavioral techniques, and one of the first cases I had was a little girl who was about 3 years old who would not eat solid food and was hospitalized for it, and we figured out how to get her eating, and it was good. It was a good year, and then I went to the University of Oregon for a year. I was going to spend a year here, and the University of Oregon at that time had really embraced behavioral things, not just in psychology, but also in the College of Education. And so you had people like Hill Walker working on school-based things, and Jerry Patterson working on clinical interventions with aggressive kids and so on, and doing studies with where nobody had ever really tried using consequences to affect human behavior. This was at the very beginning of it. And so actually I can fast forward, because I wrote The Nurture Effect because I felt like, here is a paradigm, and I understood that paradigm, and I'm just a yeoman scientist who's going to mine that paradigm. I didn't expect to do anything particularly important, and I don't think I did. But I wrote The Nurture Effect as sort of a memoir of having been there at the revolution in human behavior, which, it's a Copernican revolution, what has happened in the last 50 years in behavioral sciences. And so I tried in The Nurture Effect to organize what we had learned and to do it in a way that would be, readable to people who weren't, particularly behavioral scientists. I think that's been fairly successful, but I never hit the New York Times bestseller list. And I tried to get Nicholas Kristof to pay attention to it, because he went to an elementary school in which I introduced the PAX Good Behavior game. But anyway, that's a long story. So
yeah,
I'll stop talking and can ask another question.
I'll get to the good behavior game. I was just going to say, so this is Criminal Behaviorology podcast, and I've tried to come up with ways, improve society, help people out. And I've used this byline before, which is yours. How can behavioral science become our most important science? What would you say to that? And by the way, when you say Copernicus was, the Earth is not the center of the universe, and then Darwin was, we are just part of the living world, and I'll go through the same processes as the living world.
Well, and in fact, I at the same time that I talked about my history with getting into Skinner, but I had also read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, and that prepared me to see this as a paradigm. And in fact, that's what got me to see that first dimension as paradigmatic and non-paradigmatic. So, but you asked the question, well, how do we make this a more important science? I suppose the main way we do it is by making a difference in human well-being, thanks to that science. But it can be frustrating. Phil Knight, who created Nike and started here in Eugene, has just pledged another $500 million to the science activities at the University of Oregon. Well, that's nice, but this is the physical sciences, and I submit that the physical sciences are not going to solve the problems that we face as human beings. And in fact, we're involved in an effort to get more federal funding for behavioral science research on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We've done an analysis of the federal funding, and it's appalling how little there is. But I want to directly come back to the criminal behaviorology, because you noticed that I have one of my tacky books, and my tacky book promotion is Rebooting Capitalism: How We Can Forge a More nurturing society, a society that works for everyone. And I wrote that after Trump was elected. But it's an evolutionary account of the evolution of capitalism over the last 50 years and how it has corrupted our society. And on the basis of that book, and the book describes the reforms that are needed in every sector of society so that those sectors become more oriented toward ensuring the well-being of everyone rather than ensuring that some people can get very wealthy. And so you can go into the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, higher education, media, and in all of those areas, the dominant, free market idea that if I just pursue my own economic well-being, it'll benefit everyone, really reigns in those areas. I was just finishing a letter to Atul Gawande, who is a physician at Harvard University, who's written about this, and he shows how two cities in Texas, McAllen, Texas, and El Paso, have a huge difference in the amount of money that's spent on healthcare, and they have demographically they're the same size. They have everything's pretty much the same, except one spends twice as much. McAllen spends twice as much. So he studies this, and he shows that it's basically because the physicians in this community own the machines. They own the nursing homes and so on. And so they're just maximizing their revenue. They're very clear about what affects their revenue, and their behavior is selected by what maximizes their revenue. But it's not selected by the impact on the population health. Population health is no better in McAllen, Texas than it is in El Paso, but they do a lot more of things that make money for them. And so, first of all, you got to get population health as the outcome we're trying to affect. So this is just an example of the reforms that are needed in medicine. But let me come back to criminal justice system. We have private prisons because free market economics said, oh, yeah, they'll do better than government doing it. And, people are making a lot of money on that. That's just one example of the way that the criminal justice system is problematic. But what we have done with Rebooting Capitalism is we've created a nonprofit called Values to Action, and it's trying to implement reforms in every sector of society. And so we have meeting this week, an action circle we've created that's working on how we could improve well-being of young people by reforming the juvenile justice system. And you may very well have things that could contribute to that. I invite you to become a member of Rebooting of Values to Action for $47. You can join it. You can join an action circle. What we're trying to do is write a guide to what a community could do to improve the juvenile justice system so that fewer people get into it in the first place, and we prevent all of the problems that can be prevented through all of the kinds of things that I describe in the nurture effect. And so, but what we're trying to do here is design what a local action circle could do to try to reform locally what's done with juveniles. And an awful lot of that is to implement preventive interventions such that they never get into the juvenile justice system in the first place. So, and the action circle was instigated because one of the people who joined, a behavior analyst, said, I've always wanted to work on this. And so we said, okay, let's put together an action circle on that. So I think I finished talking.
Okay, and if you have actually later on, if you after this, if you have a link, we can put that on the with the podcast, because I'd be interested in that. I know so many people that are interested in juvenile justice.
And we hope that we can create a movement in this country. We have action circles around improving reading instruction, which, by the way, is relevant to preventing juvenile crime as well. We have them on social emotional learning. And so we think that we can help to create action circles in communities that are, implementing these reforms. So that's where we're trying to go. And if you have any millionaires in your audience, we could use some donations, because so far this has been, it's been funded by my retirement funds.
Oh, well, we don't have too many, but I'm going to look around and see.
Yeah, find me a millionaire, please.
I know I'm not one, but maybe we've got one or two out there. Related to what you said, what can you tell us about the good behavior game and how it's been used to make improvement?
Well, so the good behavior game was created by some behavior analysts in 1960s at Kansas University. There was a woman who was her husband was a graduate student in the Department of Human Development, and she was a teacher, and so she got a job teaching. just coming into Lawrence, Kansas, and she's going to be a teacher, and I think it was a third grade. And there were 3 third grades in that elementary school, and the teachers who were there the previous year sorted the kids into those 3 classrooms. And guess where they put all the kids, that were problematic? They put them in the classroom, and here, new teacher, you get to teach these kids. So by Thanksgiving, she's ready to quit. And her husband, who, is dependent on her income, among other things, says, well, let's go talk to, some of the faculty at KU. And so they got together and they talked about it, and they said, well, are these kids ever, well behaved? She said, well, if we have a spelling bee, okay. So somehow they came up with the idea that, gee, if these kids could play a game and they could get a reward for cooperating, that might work. And the first study was a multiple baseline design where they studied disruptive behavior in both reading and math, and they implemented the game in just one of those. And sure enough, disruptive behavior went way down when they did the good behavior game. And when they removed the good behavior game, it went up again. Like, this is in the 1960s. There's like 40, 50 years of research on this, mostly done by behavior analysts. So they're doing multiple baseline designs, interrupted time series designs, no randomized trials. So along comes Shep Kellum, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University. And he's looking for something that would deal with kids who are shy and aggressive, especially boys, because he's been studying criminology and the development of criminal behavior. And so he's looking for an intervention. So he learns about the good behavior game from Joe Brady. They implemented in a randomized trial where they randomized kids to classrooms. They randomized teachers to classrooms. They randomized some classrooms to get the good behavior game and some not. And he studies the effect on disruptive behavior. He studies the effect of this, and he followed these kids into young adulthood. And he found that the kids who got the good behavior game just in first and second grade, and many kids are in, this is inner city Baltimore, and they were significantly less likely to have problems with disruptive behavior, ADHD. He followed them into middle school, and the kids who got it just in first and second grade were less likely to be arrested, less likely to smoke. He followed them into young adulthood and found that the kids who got the good behavior game, it basically helped them to develop cooperation, self-regulation, and that carried them forward. They were more likely to graduate high school, more likely to attend college, less likely to have suicidal problems or antisocial behavior problems or depression. So, so that was actually revolutionary. It put the good behavior game on the map for many people, and it showed the power of a preventive intervention. And the Washington State Institute for Public Policy has done an analysis of the return on investment for that, and it's about $60 for every dollar invested in it. Now, if you could get $60 for every buck you put into an investment, you'd be the millionaire who could be funding the values to action. So anyway,
it's a game.
So now,
it's a game where the competition is to be good.
The competition is to be cooperative, exactly. And the rewards initially were things like 5 minutes extra of recess, and so on. So along comes Dennis Embry. Now, Dennis Embry was there when they developed the good behavior game in Kansas because he was a graduate student there. He's a behavior analyst. So he looks at the manual that Shep used, and he looks at it and says, teachers aren't going to be able to do this. So he figures out how he's going to do it. Well, I'm friends with Shep. I'm friends with Dennis. And when Shep found out that Dennis was going to do this, Shep was apoplectic because if he screwed it up and he tried to replicate it and it didn't replicate, it would look like, Shep was, fraudulent in some way, right? So it took a while, but the day came when I saw them in the lobby at the Society for Prevention Research walking toward each other and they hugged. And I said, we settled that. But what Dennis did was he took the game and he developed ways of training people, but he also added a set of what he calls kernels. And Dennis and I have published a paper on kernels. And by the way, if you go to the Values to Action website, most of these papers, people can find those papers there. But the kernels are simple behavior influence techniques. Most of them were developed by behavior analysts. A lot of them were published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis. So there are things like, but Dennis is very innovative. Granny's wacky prizes. Well, it turns out that if you have a reward, but you don't even know what the reward is, it's actually more reinforcing than if, you say, well, you'll have 5 minutes extra of recess. And so the Granny's wacky prizes are in a bag called Granny's Wacky Prizes, and the teacher can reach in there, and if the class was on task, we maybe just play it initially for 5 minutes, and you have groups of 4 kids, and you pull out Granny's Wacky Prize, and it says, hold your nose singing. Winning team holds their noses and sings a common nursery song, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. This sounds really, really silly. Suggested time a minute or so. Okay, that's a reward. Every one of these rewards follows the Premack principle. You can do something. It doesn't cost any money. It's an activity. Most of them are physical activities, which is good to have kids be physically active, and the kids love it. And so that's one of about 10 kernels that he uses in conjunction with actual playing the game. Dennis has now he's trained people in about 40,000 classrooms, and it's growing exponentially in terms of the number of places that it's being implemented. And we're starting to do research to see if we can show population effects of the spread of the good behavior game. For example, are kids less likely to need physician, visits? Are they more likely to do well? We're looking at trying to do a study where we're looking at the reading proficiency of kids in elementary schools and correlating it with their exposure to the good behavior game. So it's an exciting development.
A lot of people hearing this right now might put this good behavior game in the too good to be true category. That they'll say, it's like, come on, you're talking about you have a game, but you have this much benefit from it. But I'm not sure people always consider the power of behavioral intervention. So you do the right intervention, you can have a huge impact.
Well, and the results of this line up pretty well with the physiology of self-regulation. What kids are doing there, if you got 4 kids in a group and one of them's maybe the class clown and, he's good at doing something that everybody laughs, right? And the kid's getting reinforced for everybody laughing and so on. But now I'm in the group with them and I don't really want them to do that because we won't get our reward. So now you're changing the contingencies and that kid is getting reinforcement for inhibiting his, disruptive behavior. So it teaches self-regulation, and it recruits the reinforcement of other kids.
And it's not a group therapy where we bring them into the group and they've got to each talk about how they feel or what's happened to them. It's just an event where we're doing an intervention like this.
Right. It's a context for effective instruction. It's not something that you teach separately from the other things you teach. It's simply a context for teaching, the things that kids need to learn about, like how to read.
What about that you'd written in the book, a third wave in behavior therapy? In particular, what we hear a lot about nowadays, if we're into this kind of stuff, acceptance and commitment therapy, and how that's brought about change.
So, how to talk about this? It's behavior analysis. It's consistent with what Skinner was saying, but it goes beyond it in some ways that troubled some behavior analysts. But it's third wave in the sense that the first wave of behavior therapy was using things like systematic desensitization, essentially conditioning procedures that helped anxious people get comfortable with things that frightened them and so on. And it Wolpe's work, he showed that systematic desensitization reduced phobias. And so that was really based on conditioning principles. But then it became cognitive behavior therapy with people like Bandura saying that it's really people's cognitions that you need to study, and Beck developing a version of treatment of depression where we're telling people that, those thoughts are depressogenic and we want to help you to not replace these thoughts with those thoughts and so on. But the third wave was really started, I think, primarily by Steve Hayes, but there are others as well who deserve some of the credit. But what it did was it helped people to not try to control the thoughts and feelings that were troubling them, but to become willing to accept those thoughts and feelings. And so rather than struggle to control things, it helped people to have emotion. And so it really changed the way we focused. And I was a clinical psychologist and doing, behavior therapy, and worked a lot with people with anxiety. And I received the first thing that Steve Hayes had written about it. At that point, he called it comprehensive distancing. And I began to study that, and I realized that, well, I had been pretty successful with helping people with anxiety to become more calm and so on, that there were some people that I wasn't successful with. And it was in some ways because they would, I'm going to teach you to relax because you've been really anxious a lot, and we're going to teach you the principles of relaxation, right? So if you're really into not feeling anxious, it's really important not to feel anxious, then, okay, you did your relaxation, you get up the next morning and you try, okay, I'm relaxed, I'm okay. Hopefully I won't have any of those panic attacks that I've had. Is that a panic? So if you're really focused on not feeling anxious, life is about anxiety. And that does not reduce your anxiety. That makes everything about not feeling anxious. And so, what you need to do is help people to be willing to feel anxious and to turn away from making their life about not having these thoughts and feelings, but rather have their life about what they want it to be. And in fact, if you look up a TED talk that Steve Hayes did where he describes how this started, he was somebody who was plagued by panic attacks and decided that he was going to accept them. And that was what got the whole thing started. And so it's been an amazing journey, and there are, thousands of people, of clinicians who've moved in that direction. And there's an Association of Contextual Behavioral Science that was created. And in part it was created because the Association for Behavior Analysis, as much as Steve was a behavior analyst, wasn't a very accepting home for this stuff. And so they created a new organization. That's a theme that I hit a lot because I do a lot of talks to behavior analysts and point out to them that the Society for SPR, the Society for Prevention Research, the Association for Positive Behavior Support, the Society of Behavioral Medicine, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, all wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for foundational behavioral principles, but they were all sort of not accepted by the Association for Behavior Analysis. So we got all these different organizations. We're trying to bring them back together, and I think we've made some progress on that.
A bit of a schism there.
Yes. Well, it's old bulls saying, I'm right.
Yeah. Well, in particular, so beyond anxiety, the use of ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy with schizophrenia, and in your book you have one example of a patient with schizophrenia that improved her life. I think her name was Emma. Maybe you had more than one case, but what can you tell us about that?
Well, I just report on it in the book, but Steve and I wish I could remember her name because this is the woman who really did this work. It's actually the same story as anxiety. It's like if you've seen the movie that Russell Crowe was in,
Beautiful Mind, I think it was.
Right. Right. And where he's checking to see if that person is real or a hallucination.
Yeah.
And so imagine that you have a hallucination and you're frightened about this. And eventually you tell a loved one and they're frightened by it. And you go to a psychiatrist and the psychiatrist said, oh, well, we know that this is a symptom of this disease and we need to get rid of these symptoms. And so everything is about not having hallucinations, right? Well, it's the same thing. Oh, was that a hallucination? I have, from time to time, ocular migraines, and I used to have migraine headaches. And, you'd have these and it would make you so sensitive because usually you notice them when you're reading text and there are spots in your vision, right? And so for a long time I was like, well, that doesn't work. And so helping people to get clear about what they want in their lives and be willing to have what they have seems to work better. And that was how they reduced rehospitalization in people with schizophrenia. A similar process with other kinds of things where people are encouraged to get clear about what they want their lives to be about and move in the direction of what they want their lives to be about, even in the context of thoughts and feelings that say you're wrong, you're bad, this is terrible, you need to control this, and so on.
I think it was Bach and Hayes that had written about that case. Yeah,
Patty Bach, thank you.
Patty Bach had written about that case.
If she sees this now, she will forgive me.
So. We'll give credit where credit's due then. So that's very interesting. So yeah, it seems a little different than like a standard so-called medical model as I understand it, where the goal is simply to reduce or eliminate symptoms. Well, this is the acceptance of symptoms and moving on.
Right.
You write a little bit in the book about marketing practices, especially ones that parents need to be aware of. And I found that to be really a fascinating part of it. Efforts. It sounds like advertising, marketing are using some behavioral principles of their own, and yet they are motivated by just the consequences of the market to motivate them to get people to buy their products.
Well, you know that the father of behaviorism, Watson, was drummed out of psychology because he had an affair at, I think, Johns Hopkins, and he went into marketing. So marketing principles are in widespread use. In Rebooting Capitalism, actually, if you go to This View of Life, the online magazine that David Sloan Wilson created, and you search my name, Biglan, you'll find essays that I wrote, and there are 5 of them which I couldn't fit in the Rebooting Capitalism book. They are industries that evolved practices that are harmful to the population, though profitable to the industry. And so one of them is on the tobacco control. There are others on the pharmaceutical industry, the financial industry, the fossil fuel industry, and the food industry. And in every case, they evolved practices that worked for them, but don't improve the well-being of the population. And the tobacco control, the tobacco industry is the prime example, and where a lot of this got started. They were some of the biggest innovators in marketing throughout the 20th century. And I was an expert witness in U.S. versus Philip Morris et al., which was a federal lawsuit one of the largest they've ever had, against the tobacco industry. And they asked me to testify about the marketing of cigarettes to young people. And that led to my spending about a year preparing testimony on this, and really understanding the degree to which the tobacco industry was quite intentionally marketing to young people. In general, brand loyalty is established by getting to the consumer before anybody else gets to the consumer. And so the tobacco industry was fighting for that teenage smoker, because most people start smoking before the age of 18. And so, I mean, it's a long story, but the tobacco industry evolved practices that worked. And when I say evolved, this is selection by consequences. The Marlboro commercials were very successful, and they got, young people to believe that if they smoked Marlboro, they would have friends and so on. And there's some truth to that, because, let's say you want to be popular, and you don't feel like you're so popular and so on, but you're seeing all these ads that say you'll be popular. But those ads are depicting the Marlboro smoker as somebody who's tough and rugged and independent and knows what they want and is looked up to. Well, if you smoke Marlboros, your peers have already seen those ads, and so they're a little more likely to see you as, somebody who has all those features. It's, it's basically conditioning. And so the Marlboro commercials made it the leading brand by far. Well, R.J. Reynolds was trying to get its brands going, and it tried a series of ad campaigns for Camel. And they all had sort of rugged people and so on, and they just failed. They failed. And then they discovered Joe Camel, the cartoon character. Yeah. And actually, I have some paraphernalia from this, but it's not handy, or I'd show it to you. But that worked. But the selection by consequences, you would see reports in the documents of the company that say, oh, we saw a 1% increase in our sales as a result, right? And now, Philip Morris has the data on the sales of their brands in every convenience store in the country. They can try something in one, let's pick 100 convenience stores and do this in those convenience stores and see its effect. I mean, this is precise behavior analysis, right?
Well, that part of the book really made me think, because were it not for the efforts of the people trying to take on the tobacco companies and put in policies to get it under control, I think it's a good possibility I would have been a smoker. I mean, I have no interest in cigarettes, but with this much effort and behavioral technology being put in place for something that is an addictive drug, their success makes perfect sense.
Well, and you just alluded to the tobacco control movement, and that is a model for how we can deal with these things, because despite hundreds of millions of dollars spent by the tobacco industry, we've significantly reduced the proportion of people who smoke through policies and market and public education. It's really made a huge difference. However, we haven't kept up with some of the other countries, because, if you'll pardon me for a second, Australia developed what they call plain packaging, but it's not plain packaging, it's graphic packaging. And this is an Australian package. I was an expert for Australia in some of their litigation about whether or not they could do this. And then on the back, there's a picture of someone who died of smoking-related illness, and that has reduced smoking further in Australia. But But come back to the tobacco control movement for another reason. If you read Rebooting Capitalism, I propose a series of reforms in business, in higher education, and health, and so on. But what we need is a social movement, a movement that says we want to change practices in every one of these areas so that we select practices that benefit people, and we diminish practices that harm people. Mm-hmm. Which is to say, we make sure that if you engage in a practice that can demonstrably show harm to the population, you must lose money doing that. Mm-hmm. Take the pharmaceutical industry as an example. The pharmaceutical industry has made billions of dollars selling opioids, claiming that they were not as addictive as they in fact are. And they have caused hundreds of thousands of deaths due to that marketing, right? They've paid penalties for their marketing, but they still made money. It's just the cost of doing business. That cannot be. We need a policy that says that any practice that harms the population has to be a money loser. And if you do that, that's the contingency that will stop the marketing of these harmful products. And it's true in the contribution of the food industry to obesity, the cigarette industry, and so on.
What was the Powell memo? A document about how corporations plan to make money. That was an interesting read. Tell us a little bit about the Powell memo from quite a long time ago.
I elaborate on that in Rebooting Capitalism. Mm-hmm. Lewis Powell was a lawyer, prominent lawyer in business, and in fact, he was on the board of one of the tobacco companies. I think it was Philip Morris. 1970, there were 1,900 bombings of businesses in the United States. A significant portion of the population in the United States didn't like business, didn't respect business, thought it was terrible. Revolutionary socialists and so on. Mm-hmm. So Lewis Powell and his network were rightly concerned about the future of business. And he wrote a memo to his neighbor, who was the chair of the Chamber of Commerce, and he rather dispassionately and I think accurately analyzed the situation and said that, academics and young people are anti-business, and it's up to business to figure out how we can do a better job of advocating for business. And that memo has been widely credited with starting or encouraging many members of the business community to start to invest in systematically advocating for business. And so they did, and they advocated for free market economics and the invisible hand, that in a market system, if a market system is the best way to make sure that people will maximize the quality of the products they have, they'll make them cheaper and so on, and markets produce good things. And there's some truth to that. If you don't think that markets are useful, then turn in your cell phone, because the cell phone wouldn't exist if it hadn't been for market competition. Mm-hmm. But it's not essentially true. It's not always true. And so there's a movement against the free market economics called evonomics, and it's an evolutionary approach to economics. And if you go to This View of Life, you'll find numerous essays on that, and I cover it in Rebooting Capitalism. But we have to have a social movement. I think one of the things that I advocate, I published a paper on the nurture consilience, and if you go to Values to Action website and look for the publications, you'll find that paper. And I basically argue, and this comes out of the nurture effect, that in fact we know what people need to thrive, and that is the basis around which I think we could create a coalition of not just of behavioral science organizations, but of all the organizations that are trying to improve well-being. that we come together around a vision of a society in which is organized to ensure the well-being of every person, every person.
I think it was the old movie quite a long time ago, an old Humphrey Bogart movie, and he's it's long gone, but Sabrina, and in that movie he gives a little speech. But they ask, well, why are you a businessman? And he gives a nice little speech about, well, I do it for the people that never saw a dime. Now they have dollars in their pocket, and so on and so forth. And that, I thought that view was a very standard American view about capitalism and entrepreneurship. I guess you're saying the unrestricted capitalism really needs to be taken a look at.
Right. And there's a movement underway. I mean, there's a lot of push for reform. And let me say something else about, I want to say something about capitalism and racism. Because in Rebooting Capitalism, I describe the way in which business discovered, I mean, here are all these people who are trying to advocate for free market economics, small government, low taxes, and so on, and they've succeeded, very well. They've been reinforced for their advocacy, and if you look, there's a chart in Rebooting Capitalism that shows that the percent of wealth that goes to the top 1/10 of 1% has just gone way up since the 1970s, thanks to the advocacy for free market economics. And it's really selection by consequences. They tried this, didn't work. Okay. They tried that. It worked. Okay. Well, they kept that in their act. They amplified that, and they got better and better in reducing their taxation and increasing their wealth. Okay. So what does that have to do with racism? Well, I don't think that the conservative billionaires set out to increase racism. They simply found that if they could convince poor white people that big government was simply giving things away to those people, they could get the political support of poor white people. And what happened with Trump was simply that he came forward with an explicit, kind of racism beyond any of the dog whistle racism that previous conservatives had promoted, and he's been very successful in doing that. And so now I think we have some systematic efforts, a growing movement to understand the degree to which racism has harmed all of us. And I would particularly recommend Heather McGhee's book, which is called The Sum of Us, because she points out that, in fact, convincing all these people that government is bad and that you don't want those people to, be getting the things that they get has harmed everyone. And she gives the example of when the civil rights bills were passed in the 1960s, it was that when they were enforced, one of the things that were enforced was that black kids could be able to swim in public swimming pools along with white kids. And she has pictures of the pools around the country that were simply filled with dirt, and they closed those pools rather than integrate them. Now, who benefited from that? I mean, you're somebody who's concerned that those people are getting more than I'm getting, and so you say, yeah, that you're cutting off your nose to spite your face, and so we're in a situation now where the racism is overt, and it's a struggle, but I am hopeful that we are going to promote the well-being of every person, but we have to convince enough people who are on the Trump bandwagon to slip off that bandwagon unnoticed. And I think Biden has got a good approach to it, because he's just saying you're going to have jobs, you're going to have good paying jobs, you're going to have health care, and so on. And so people can turn from doing QAnon to, working on sustainability if they've got a good job. So Anyway, much to be done, but we need a social movement where everybody's working together. And that's what Values to Action is about. We're trying to make some contribution to that movement.
You think much, and around the world, much of the conflicts around the world are centrally economic in nature. That, in other words, if the economic factor wasn't there, that's almost unimaginable, but if the economic factors weren't there, there would not be so much conflict in so many of these countries around the world.
Well, capitalism as it's currently practiced is it was what Milton Friedman argued back in the 1980s, that the job of a corporation is to make money, and you just let them make money and everything will be fine.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's international. And if that's the only criterion for corporations, we're going to continue to have these problems. The B Corp movement and the conscious capitalism movement, and now even the Business Roundtable says that they've embraced this, though this I got to see if they actually do, is that a corporation should have the responsibility of the well-being of investors. And by the way, an employee-owned company, they could be the investors, and it should be concerned about the well-being of its employees, its customers, and the society as a whole. And we need to establish those norms, and we need to make government policy based on those norms, not based on the norm that the profits of the corporation is all we care about in our policy making, but policies that ensure the well-being of the population.
Mm-hmm. You had not met me before, but I've been in your presence because I was sitting next to you. I think it was in November of 2018. The Association for Behavior Analysis International had a substance abuse conference, and I think it's the only one they ever had.
Yes.
And you actually, I thought your statement on there was the most memorable one, I think, of that. And you alluded to that earlier about the pharmaceutical interests and how that's led to our current predicament with drug use. So what would you say, a little recap of that, and what are your views on that now?
Well, I talked a little earlier in this conversation about the fact that the drug companies found it profitable to market opioids, arguing that they were not harmful, not addictive, and so on. And I mean, you look at what they did. There was one town in West Virginia that there were millions of pills going through that tiny town. Couldn't have just been for them. The industry cared not at all about it. But the other thing I remember from that conference was that I realized toward the end that there hadn't been enough said about prevention. And largely because the expertise of people there was largely, some really good things that they've developed in terms of reducing substance use, treating addiction, and so on,
mm-hmm.
But not as much on prevention. And so we ended up publishing a paper for a special issue that came out of that on prevention. So I'm not sure I have more to say about that other than it's another example of the way in which we have to have policies that require companies to minimize their harm and lose money when they minimize their harm.
Well, I just don't think most people are thinking of a connection between how pharmaceutical companies are acting and drug use as a whole and how they could be connected. Yes.
Well, in fact, I've been waiting for the tobacco industry to buy into the marijuana
mm-hmm.
marketing, and I've been watching, because Oregon is one of the places that legalized it, and I've been watching. There are no strong provisions regarding the marketing of marijuana, and there need to be, because it's the same thing. You got a product, you're going to sell it to young people, and they'll pursue your brand. So.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an opinion on whether drugs should be legalized or decriminalized? How should we handle something like that?
Well, if you look at Portugal, they have decriminalized all drugs and put much more into treatment and recovery. In Oregon, we have a significant drug problem, and I think it's improved somewhat. Most of the people who had drug abuse problems were unable to get treatment. So we need to increase the availability of treatment, but we also need to implement preventive interventions that make it less likely that people get on a track that they start using substances. I mean, one of the reasons people drink, which, by the way, alcohol is the most problematic of the substances because it accounts for the most deaths. So we need policies that prevent the development of problems with alcohol. One of them is there needs to be greater restriction on marketing. The evidence is that marketing, a teenager will see more ads for alcohol than an adult because of the things that they watch on TV. So we need to regulate the marketing of these substances, but we also need to prevent to make sure that kids are succeeding, that they live in families that are nurturing, that are not coercive, that are skilled in supporting the development of each child. We need schools that ensure that kids learn to read, that they learn to cooperate. And, we do those things, and our population is going to be increasingly better off. We need nurturing environments that minimize coercion and conflict, that richly reinforce pro-social behavior, that limit opportunities and influences for problem behavior, and that promote psychological flexibility, which is I didn't actually use that term, but when you're helping somebody to be clear about their values and be willing to work toward their values and be willing to have the thoughts and feelings that come up, that's psychological flexibility.
The policies you promote are there to promote people's well-being and that flexibility that they need.
Yes. And promote the values and norms that would make that the context for what we do in a society.
Well, that's excellent. I'm going to get your capitalism book then, because I really enjoyed the nurture effect quite a bit. That was kind of the total list of my questions, I guess. But I do appreciate you coming on. You want to say something else?
Yes, you can get Rebooting Capitalism at the Values to Action website. Should I give you... Actually, if you search values-to-action.com, you'll find it. So
I'll find it and I'll put it on there. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I invite people to join Values to Action. Currently we've got about 145 people who've joined, and they're excited about making a difference. And so, one of the things that I have realized I've talked to literally hundreds of behavior analysts in my travels since the book came out. I probably talked to 25 or more behavior analytic organizations. But what I so frequently hear is that a lot of people feel that like they're trapped in only working in developmental disabilities or only working with people with Asperger's syndrome. And, what they were told was that this science could be relevant to solving all of the problems of society. And so what we're trying to do is expand the repertoire of behavior analysts. We've got an action circle that's working on how we can get more behaviorally skilled people into healthcare settings to provide help that the people in those health settings, aren't necessarily equipped to do, like have a kid with autism have a blood draw. You need a behaviorist to, make that happen. So you join Values to Action, and I think we can help to expand the repertoire of behavior analysts and expand their impact in society.
Yeah. Almost every behavior analyst I speak to, they want to expand their work into other areas. It's values-to-action.org.
Values-to-action.org.
Yeah,
yes.
You've got it. Tony, thank you so much for the work you're doing and everything that you've and taking the time out to tell us everything you have today. Maybe if I get to your capitalism book, we could have another interview.
Happy to do it.
Okay.
And I greatly appreciate your asking me to do this. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And thank you for your work in getting the word out about our science.
Always. Tony, have a great rest of your afternoon, and maybe we'll be speaking to you in the near future.
I look forward to it.
Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been Criminal Behaviorology. Check us out on podomatic.com or anchor.fm. Please send questions, comments and requests for transcripts to criminalbehaviorology@gmail.com.